He arrived expecting fences, guards, and confinement. But what he found instead were endless rows of vines, open fields under the sun, and days spent working the soil of a land he had never imagined touching with his hands. The transition into vineyard labor did not begin as a dramatic event or a sudden turning point, but as a quiet reassignment that slowly reshaped the rhythm of his daily existence, moving him from enclosed camp routines into open agricultural space where the structure of life was no longer defined by fences and formations, but by rows of vines, soil patterns, seasonal cycles, and the steady physical demands of field work that replaced confinement with motion and repetition with cultivation. The first days were marked by unfamiliar textures rather than fear, by the weight of tools in his hands, the resistance of earth beneath his boots, and the continuous presence of sunlight across wide open fields that replaced the visual compression of barracks and wire, creating an environment that felt expansive not because it promised freedom, but because it offered physical space that reoriented perception and attention. Work began early in the morning and followed the logic of the land rather than the logic of confinement, moving with weather conditions, soil conditions, and harvest cycles that shaped the flow of time in ways that felt organic rather than imposed, allowing the body to adapt to a different form of structure where discipline emerged from necessity rather than authority. The vineyard itself functioned as a living system, where every task had purpose, every motion had consequence, and every routine contributed to a visible result, creating a psychological environment where effort translated into tangible change, unlike camp labor that often felt abstract, detached, and disconnected from visible outcomes. As days passed, the repetitive motions of pruning, carrying, sorting, and tending began to form a new internal rhythm, where exhaustion was physical rather than psychological, and fatigue came from work completed rather than from waiting endured. Interaction with the land introduced a different relationship with time, one based on growth cycles rather than schedules, seasons rather than commands, and continuity rather than uncertainty, creating a sense of stability rooted in natural processes instead of institutional control. The physicality of the work reshaped attention, pulling the mind away from abstract anticipation and toward immediate sensory experience, where heat, wind, soil, and movement became the dominant elements of awareness. Even the presence of supervision felt different in this environment, not as constant surveillance, but as distant oversight integrated into daily function rather than imposed as psychological pressure. The vineyard did not represent freedom, and it did not represent escape, but it introduced a form of daily normalcy that stood in contrast to the artificial structure of captivity, where life was no longer centered on waiting, but on doing, no longer shaped by anticipation, but by participation, and no longer defined by internal uncertainty, but by visible contribution to a living system that continued to grow regardless of who worked within it. Through this slow and silent shift, his identity began to reorganize around function rather than status, around routine rather than role, and around presence rather than projection, as the vineyard became not a symbol of change, but the setting in which change quietly began to take form without announcement, resistance, or conscious intention. Many people who enjoy these stories watch on television. Subscribing helps make sure the next story appears automatically. As the days in the vineyard accumulated, the work began to shape not only his body, but his internal sense of order, as repetition transformed unfamiliar labor into predictable routine and unfamiliar space into a structured environment where daily life followed a rhythm that no longer felt temporary or improvised, but stable, continuous, and self-sustaining. The physical layout of the fields created a natural organization that replaced the artificial geometry of the camp, where rows of vines formed corridors of movement, Workstations emerged naturally from the land itself, and the logic of labor followed patterns of growth, care, and maintenance rather than command and control. Each task carried a visible purpose, whether it was clearing soil, supporting growth, maintaining structure, or preparing for harvest, creating a relationship between effort and outcome that made daily labor feel meaningful in a direct, tangible way rather than symbolic or imposed. The land responded to work, and that response created psychological reinforcement, as progress could be seen, touched, and measured in living change rather than recorded in schedules or reports. The environment itself contributed to this transformation, as open air replaced enclosed space, natural sound replaced institutional silence, and the sensory presence of wind, insects, birds, and distant human activity created a living atmosphere that continuously reminded the mind that life was happening beyond systems of control and confinement. Time moved differently in this setting, not as a sequence of enforced hours, but as a flow shaped by light, weather, and physical endurance, where fatigue became a natural signal rather than a psychological weight, and rest became recovery rather than waiting. His awareness gradually shifted from internal monitoring to external engagement, as attention became anchored in movement, coordination, and physical balance instead of internal anticipation and mental calculation. Social interaction also changed in tone and meaning, as work created functional relationships rather than hierarchical ones, where cooperation emerged from necessity rather than obligation, and communication centered on task rather than status. Even when language was limited, coordination developed through shared motion, shared rhythm, and shared purpose, forming a quiet sense of belonging that was based not on identity or ideology, but on mutual participation in the same physical process. The vineyard became a space where existence was defined less by who one was and more by what one did, shifting identity away from labels and toward function. Over time, this environment reshaped his internal orientation toward life itself, as the future stopped feeling like a distant abstraction and the past stopped dominating attention, replaced by a present that was full, structured, and psychologically sufficient. The land required care every day, the work required consistency, and the routine required presence, creating a life rhythm that did not depend on imagined outcomes or distant destinations in order to feel complete. His mind no longer revolved around questions of return or release, not because those possibilities disappeared, but because they no longer structured his daily attention. What mattered was the immediate continuity of life as it was lived, not as it was remembered or anticipated. The vineyard did not remove the reality of captivity, but it altered the experience of existence within it, replacing psychological stagnation with movement, replacing abstract waiting with concrete action, and replacing uncertainty with rhythm. Through this slow process, captivity became less of a defining identity and more of a background condition, as life reorganized itself around daily structure rather than institutional status. The transformation was not emotional, dramatic, or symbolic, but practical, embodied, and gradual, built through thousands of repeated movements, routines, and hours of labor that quietly constructed a new internal stability without announcement, resistance, or conscious reflection. As the routine of vineyard life continued to stabilize his daily existence, a deeper shift began to take place within his sense of self, one that did not emerge through reflection or conscious decision, but through sustained immersion in a world where identity was shaped by function, continuity, and repetition rather than by history, status, or expectation. The longer he remained within this environment, the less his mind organized itself around the idea of being a prisoner, and the more it oriented itself around being a worker within a living system that required attention, reliability, and care. The vineyard did not ask who he had been, where he had come from, or what uniform he once wore, but only whether he showed up, whether he worked, and whether he participated in the daily cycle that sustained the land. This shift did not feel like transformation because it lacked contrast and drama, unfolding instead as a gradual realignment of perception where the categories that once defined him lost their psychological relevance. The distinction between captivity and normal life became less visible in daily experience, not because captivity disappeared, but because normal life began to exist inside it. The structure of the days created a sense of continuity that did not require freedom in order to feel real, and did not require escape in order to feel meaningful. Life no longer felt suspended between two worlds, but contained within one coherent rhythm that repeated itself with consistency and reliability. The physical world reinforced this internal change as the landscape itself became familiar and predictable, turning once foreign terrain in a known space where every row, every path, and every task held a stable place within his mental map of the environment. Movement through the fields became automatic, guided by memory rather than instruction, and the body began to navigate space with confidence instead of caution. This familiarity produced a subtle form of belonging, not emotional attachment, but spatial integration, where the land itself felt navigable, readable, and internally mapped. Work became more than labor, evolving into a form of daily structure that anchored his sense of time and purpose. Morning was defined by preparation, midday by sustained effort, and evening by physical exhaustion that carried a sense of completion rather than depletion. The cycle repeated without internal resistance, forming a rhythm that the mind accepted as normal rather than temporary. Days stopped feeling like placeholders and began feeling like actual lived time, where existence was experienced directly rather than endured. The presence of others within this environment also shifted in meaning, as relationships were no longer mediated primarily by shared captivity, but by shared participation in work. Cooperation replaced comparison, coordination replaced hierarchy, and routine replaced tension. Interaction became practical rather than emotional, functional rather than symbolic, forming quiet bonds based on shared responsibility rather than shared identity. The vineyard created a social structure rooted in task and continuity, not ideology or origin. Over time, this world produced a subtle psychological grounding, with a mind no longer scanned constantly for change, release, or movement, but settled into the stability of repetition. The future lost its urgency, the past lost its gravity, and the present became sufficient in itself. Life did not feel complete because it was free, and did not feel trapped because it was confined, but felt coherent because it was structured, predictable, and internally consistent. In this stage, his existence became defined less by circumstance and more by continuity, as daily life shaped identity through action rather than narrative. The vineyard did not offer him a new ideology or a new dream, but something quieter and more powerful, a stable rhythm of existence where meaning emerged from participation, not aspiration, and where life was lived through routine rather than imagined through hope. As this rhythm of work and continuity deepened, the vineyard began to function not just as a place of labor, but as the primary structure through which his entire sense of reality was organized, shaping how he experienced time, space, and existence itself. Days no longer felt like isolated units within captivity, but like parts of a continuous flow, where one task led naturally into the next, and one season prepared the ground for another, creating a living structure that made life feel ordered rather than suspended. The repetition of agricultural cycles introduced a form of stability that did not depend on institutions, rules, or authority, but on natural processes that continued regardless of politics, war, or captivity. The environment itself reinforced this internal stability, as the land followed rhythms that were larger than any single person, making individual identity feel less central than participation in a system that existed beyond him. Growth, decay, harvest, and renewal formed patterns that gave meaning to effort and context to endurance, allowing daily work to feel connected to something continuous rather than temporary. In this setting, time no longer felt like something to be waded through, but something that moved forward with purpose and direction. His relationship with the concept of captivity continued to change, not because the reality of confinement disappeared, but because it lost its dominance over his psychological experience. The vineyard did not erase the fences, the guards, or the system that controlled his life, but it redirected his attention away from those structures and toward the immediate demands of living, working, and maintaining balance within the present environment. The mind, focused on what must be done each day, gradually reduced its attention to what might happen someday. The idea of return remained present as information, but not as orientation, because it no longer organized his daily thinking or emotional life. The future existed, but it did not guide him, and the past remained, but it no longer defined him. His identity became increasingly rooted in function rather than memory, in participation rather than projection, and in continuity rather than transition. The person he had been before captivity became a distant reference point rather than a central anchor of self. The physicality of the work continued to ground him in the present, as the body adapted to long hours of movement, repetitive tasks, and seasonal demands that required endurance rather than imagination. Fatigue became physical rather than psychological, and rest became recovery rather than escape, reinforcing a life rhythm based on cycles of effort and renewal rather than cycles of tension and release. Socially, the vineyard created a contained human world that revolved around cooperation, reliability, and shared routine, where relationships were defined by presence and participation rather than by origin or ideology. Trust emerged not from belief, but from consistency, as people learned who could be relied upon, who showed up, and who contributed to the daily work that sustained the system. Belonging in this context was not emotional attachment, but functional integration. Over time, this structure produced a quiet form of psychological anchoring, where life no longer felt fragmented between identities, places, and futures, but unified within a single lived reality. The vineyard did not become home in a sentimental sense, and America did not become a symbol of freedom in an ideological sense, but daily existence became coherent in a way that required no comparison to another life in order to feel complete. In this stage of transformation, the vineyard had become more than a place of work. It had become the environment through which his mind organized meaning, stability, and identity, allowing a form of life to exist that was not defined by captivity or freedom, but by continuity, routine, and participation in a living system that gave structure to existence without needing to explain itself. As the seasons passed and the vineyard continued its steady cycles of growth, care, harvest, and renewal, the life he lived within this environment began to feel internally complete in a way that no longer depended on comparison with any other world, as if the psychological need for an alternative reality had slowly dissolved into the stability of the one he was already living. Daily existence no longer felt like a temporary condition or a suspended state between two lives, but like a continuous flow of time where each day followed the next with structure, purpose, and coherence. The vineyard had become not a chapter in his life, but the framework through which life itself was experienced. The idea of another future still existed in theory, but it no longer shaped his inner orientation, because the present provided everything the mind required in order to feel organized, balanced, and grounded. Memory no longer dominated attention. Anticipation no longer directed thought, and imagination no longer defined purpose. Because meaning had become embedded in routine, repetition, and physical participation in the living system around him. Life was no longer something to be resumed later, but something that was happening now, every day, through work, movement, and continuity. The physical environment reinforced this internal state, as the land continued to demand care regardless of personal history, nationality, or identity, creating a world where existence was defined by responsibility rather than biography. The vines required tending, the soil required preparation, and the cycles of growth required patience, creating a form of order that did not depend on ideology or authority, but on natural necessity. In this structure, the question of who he had been became less important than what he did each day, and the question of where he would go became less important than where he stood. His sense of self reorganized around presence rather than projection, around function rather than identity, and around continuity rather than transformation, creating a psychological condition in which life felt internally stable without requiring movement or change to feel meaningful. The concept of captivity no longer structured his inner life, and the concept of freedom no longer defined his hopes, because both had lost their power to organize meaning in a world that already felt coherent. The vineyard did not erase the reality of imprisonment, but it replaced its psychological dominance with a different form of existence, one based on rhythm, structure, and participation in a living process that continued regardless of individual circumstance. The mind adapted not through belief or acceptance, but through alignment with what was consistent, predictable, and real. Other prisoners continued to carry their futures as central narratives, organizing their identities around return, reintegration, and imagined lives beyond the war. But for him, those narratives no longer resonated because his psychological reality no longer depended on distant destinations. The future existed, but did not command attention, and the past existed, but it did not define meaning, leaving the present as the primary space where identity, purpose, and existence were formed. In this final stage of transformation, the life he lived in the vineyard had become not an exception, not a temporary condition, and not a strange interruption of history, but a complete psychological world where stability replaced uncertainty, routine replaced waiting, and continuity replaced longing. Without any conscious decision, without any dramatic turning point, and without any declaration of change, a different form of life had taken root, one that did not require escape, return, or reinvention in order to feel real, but existed fully within the quiet, repetitive, living structure of the land itself. In the end, the vineyard did not change his status, his history, or the reality of his captivity, but it changed the way his life was experienced from the inside, transforming existence from a condition of waiting into a condition of living. What reshaped him was not freedom and not ideology, but routine, continuity, and the quiet structure of daily work that gave his days form, rhythm, and coherence without needing meaning to be explained or justified. This was not a story of escape and not a story of liberation, but a story of psychological relocation, where life slowly shifted from being something postponed to something lived, and from being something imagined to something practiced. The land did not give him a new identity, but it gave him a way of existing that no longer depended on memory, anticipation, or return in order to feel real. He did not stop being a prisoner in the legal sense, and he did not become free in the political sense, but he entered a different form of life where meaning came from participation rather than destination, from routine rather than hope, and from continuity rather than change. In that quiet transformation, the vineyard became more than a workplace, becoming the structure through which existence itself was organized, until the life he was never meant to live became simply the life he was living. This is not the story of a man who found freedom in captivity, but the story of how the human mind adapts to stability, structure, and repetition, until life no longer requires escape in order to feel whole, and existence no longer requires another future in order to feel complete. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.